Good to see you, Dr. Bruce.
Hey, Will, how are you, brother?
I'm doing great. Good to see you. Yeah. Thank you guys for bearing with us as we just iron out a few technical difficulties. We'll get started. Dr. Bruce has generously given his time today to talk about sleep. I'll just give a quick background for those who may not be familiar with you.
Of course.
Dr. Michael Bruce is the sleep doctor. He's a clinical psychologist, a board certified sleep specialist, and he's in the business of helping sleep now for several decades.
Yeah.
He's also the author of a new book, which maybe I'll let you talk about a little bit later. There you go. Awesome. And I thought maybe to start out, I'll give people some brief context for how we
Yeah.
connected. And that kind of segues into the conversation about sleep and altitude. So, for those who may be joining and don't know me, I'm Will. I'm the founder of ALTISNOOZE. I'm a guy who couldn't sleep at altitude. And this went on for me for decades until I got frustrated enough that I wanted to better understand what was going on. And Dr. Bruce does a lot of public speaking. He actually did a talk with the Summit community, which I'm a part of, and learned about Dr. Bruce and his work. And I said, wow, I'd love to get to talk to this guy. And it happened that some folks were able to make an introduction. And I reached out to them and I said, like, what is this a thing? Why can I not sleep at altitude? What is going on? And maybe I'll tee it over to you to let you speak a little bit to how you address that
Yeah.
question and any sort of foundational insights about sleep and altitude.
Of course, of course. So first of all, thanks for having me on the Instagram, Will. I appreciate it. So you left out one of the best parts of the story, which was our first meeting was actually on the beach, where we got a chance to hang out and spend some time together face to face. And I got to learn more about Will and what he likes to do and why he was so passionate. So it turns out that he's an expert skier and he loves being in the mountains and doing all of that kind of good stuff. And so we started he started asking me, he said, look, I don't sleep really well when I go skiing, and then I'm exhausted, and then I don't do well, and what's going on? Like, is this a thing? And absolutely, it's a thing. He's experienced it. And interestingly enough, I shared with Will that my daughter ended up having high altitude insomnia when we went to Keystone, which is pretty high up there. And she was very young, and we had no idea what it was at the time, which is kind of strange when you're a sleep doctor and your daughter, who's like 6, can't fall asleep. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you have no idea what's going on. And the only thing that's changed is now we're at quite a level higher elevation. So we ended up having to use oxygen therapy for her. We had to then bring her down the mountain and acclimatize her and all of that stuff. And so, as many of you know, when something happens to your kid, that is locked and loaded in your brain forever. And so when he started asking me about, altitude, insomnia, and things like that, that's the first thing I started thinking about was parents. Then when he started telling me about also, what about like people who like to ski a lot and do black diamonds and all this kind of stuff. And so I was like, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Let's have a conversation. And so that's really kind of where it all sort of started out. As a general rubric for people to kind of understand, there is some specific reasons why we don't sleep particularly well at altitude.
Great.
It almost exclusively has to do with our body's ability to exchange oxygen and breathe at higher altitudes. What ends up happening is our body doesn't have that oxygen exchange that goes really well. Also, we see a fairly large number of awakenings, meaning that people have a tendency to sleep in a lighter stage of sleep, which can also be problematic. Then that's not the only thing, because usually you've flown to that place. So you might have a circadian difference or some form of a jet lag that could be contributory to these types of feelings. And so then all of a sudden you've spent all this time and energy to get to the mountain, you get to the top, and you're exhausted. You don't feel like skiing. You don't feel like having fun. You can't figure it out what's going on here. And you ruin your trip when in fact, there are a few simple things that people could consider doing that could be actually very valuable in trying to understand the situation. And so that's kind of where Will and I kind of cross points.
Awesome. That's helpful. Great way to lay the foundation. So, what struck me as I got into it and I learned the insights and research from what was going on in the body, is that it's foundationally what causes altitude sickness type symptoms is the same thing that's causing the sleep issues. It's just
Right.
oxygen, an oxygen problem. And so part of what I thought would be interesting to get into first, although we're not here to talk about altitude sickness, the root issue is oxygenation and
Correct.
acclimatization. And if you can help improve acclimatization, you can help sort of raise the tide, as it were, to all sleep issues or all altitude issues, including sleep. So maybe it would just be helpful for us to chat about like what can people do just basically to help with going to altitude, to some best practices before we start to get into sleep
Sure,
stuff.
sure. Sure. So, number one, hydration is massive. So many people don't realize the relationship between breathing and hydration in the body, and especially at altitude when there's not as much moisture in the air. So, hydration turns out to be a very big factor just overall in terms of breathing. Also, one of the other things is to acclimatize, right? To start out at a high elevation, but not the highest elevation that you're going to be at, and slowly allowing your body to adapt. Now, to be fair, those famous rock climbers that go up Everest and all of this stuff, they do all of that kind of thing. They go to base camp and they're there for a few weeks so that their bodies will acclimatize. And basically what that really means is that they can breathe, right? So when you talk to anybody that goes to base camp or any of those high altitude places first, I mean, taking 20 steps and they're exhausted. And it's really interesting because I don't think anybody can have a true appreciation for it until it hits them. When they're trying to chug it at altitude, or you're just like, what just happened to my body? Like my whole body isn't working any longer. And so I like the idea of thinking fundamentally about altitude and breathing, right? Because it cuts across every single, aspect of the body. Because if you're not getting oxygen, the entire body system from an energy standpoint begins to shut down and only work on what's primary. And so everything else kind of goes to the wayside.
Yeah. There's an image on Instagram I saw in the last year of Lady Gaga in the hospital in Denver. She'd gone there on tour and ended up with like severe altitude sickness just in Denver. So it hits different
Yeah.
people differently. But
And
Dr. Breus kind of hit on the key things, which is go easy in the
yeah.
beginning, hydrate, and also do it gradually. You can't
Yeah.
go straight to
Oh,
10,000 feet.
yes, please, please, please. I thank you for bringing that up, Will, because I think I just assumed that people would understand that, but no, no, no. You have to gradually do it. Like it takes days in some cases. With my daughter, it took us 2 days to drive down, get her acclimatized, and then get her back up there. And by the way, we used oxygen therapy with her. That's also something that one of the things that you could consider utilizing is some form of oxygen therapy or something along those lines. But got to be honest with you, now you're toting around an O2 tank everywhere you go. That's not too fun.
So funny you should mention that. Last year I learned that there are companies up in Colorado that are installing these $60, $70, $80,000 home oxygenation systems
Right.
for rich people. I imagine in Telluride and Aspen who can afford that.
Yep.
And I said, okay, if you have $60,000 to spend and you want the best solution for sleeping at altitude, that's it. If you want the second best solution for $6, I'm the guy. But okay.
Absolutely.
Well, so let's switch gears to talk a little bit more specifically about sleep now. And
Of course.
before we talk about sleep at altitude specifically, like what are some of the hot tips you could give people and insights on just foundational sleep hygiene? Because
Yeah.
even I tell people without the snooze, it's not a panacea. If your sleep
Right.
routine is bad, if you're having a cappuccino and like a
Yes.
shot of whiskey at 10 o'clock, like I can't help
It
you.
ain't going
So
well.
so let's just talk for a minute about sleep hygiene 101 that
Yeah.
people can do to help us all out.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? And so the way I try to explain it to people is if you're on a diet, right, you don't just eat salads 5 days a week, right? And then go eat chocolate cake all weekend and expect any level of weight loss, right? It just isn't going to work out that way, right? And I think the same holds true with sleep is number one, it's about consistency. And I love the fact that you bring up you should be consistent in terms of your sleep. And so what ends up happening is sometimes you've been traveling, right? So there could be a jet lag component, or you're just excited to be there, or you're meeting friends that you haven't seen in a while. So what ends up happening? You drink too much alcohol at night, right? Because everybody's got those wonderfully delicious hot cocos with, the Baileys in them and all this other awesome stuff, right? And you don't even think about it. But alcohol in particular, alcohol turns out to be one of the big things that has a massive impact on the quality of the sleep that you're getting, specifically stages 3, 4 sleep. And so one of the biggest things that I tell people is, number one, you really don't need to drink alcohol while you're doing this. I mean, I get it, it's fun and what have you, or if you're going to do it, have it be very limited. I'd say the bigger tip, though, is to wake up at the same time 7 days a week, right? And so what ends up happening is by doing that, your brain and your body know what time to go to bed, know what time to wake up, and there's this level of consistency that happens. Then when something weird happens, like you go up top of a mountain, right? Your brain says, oh, okay, this is a unique situation, but because you've had so much consistency, you can continue to layer in that consistency and your body snaps back really, really quickly. So number one tip, wake up at the same time every single day. Number two tip, I would limit the amount of alcohol that you drink, specifically in the evening time, because while it might make you feel sleepy, it's probably not going to be too helpful. The third thing I would consider is looking at caffeine consumption. That's another biggie. Like when I'm on the slopes, and I'm usually in the chairlift talking to the person next to me, what's ending up happening is they've opened up their fanny pack and there's some goodie in there. It's either, like a gel or a caffeine pill or some energy bar or energy drinks or all of those types of things. I would caution people, water is much better in this situation. Number one, most of those energy drinks aren't particularly hydrating. I mean, they have liquid in them, but you're going to be so much better off actually just hydrating. And in some cases, it might even make sense to use something called a hydration multiplier. So adding a little bit of salt to your water so that way you maintain that absorption is going to be important as well. And then I think the final thing to remember here is you don't need to be a hero the first day, right? Or even the second day. Like, don't go balls out and think that it's not going to have a massive effect on you later on. Like, you really need to ease into this, almost like a crawl, walk, run is probably the best way to do this, especially if you have it's known that you have effects at altitude. Now, to be fair, the rest of our family really didn't have much of an effect at altitude, but with my daughter, she had a dramatic effect at altitude. So you have to kind of know your body as well.
Yep. Awesome. I will mention, because this is something I didn't realize when I was starting out, there are products out there for altitude sickness, just focusing
Very
on
different.
that. And one thing I didn't realize, or I learned the hard way with some of them, is some contain ingredients that are helpful for acclimatization, but are energizing.
Yes.
So ginkgo biloba is one that's great for acclimatization, but can be energizing. Rhodiola, I was up all night, 2 nights in a row before I figured out that rhodiola is energizing. So should go without saying, we were very careful, the team that I worked with, when we were developing ALTISNOOZE, to not have ingredients that would be stimulating and keep you up at night, but would help with some of the support your body needs for acclimatization, a little bit of electrolytes, some of the other stuff. We don't need to get into the formula in detail, but I'll just mention that in case people are like, oh, great, I'll just take an acclimatization product at night. That's not always the best idea.
Let's do a quick double tap on that just so that people know and understand. I would say, I mean, I've looked at several of those kind of altitude products. I would say almost 90% of them got some high level of stimulation from one of the ingredients in it. So I think people really need to just be very thoughtful and really check out the ingredient profile. Like, those are meant to wake you up and to get you acclimatized. They're not what we're talking about, which is to be able to not only have that energy and be able to have that oxygen exchange, but be able to get to sleep at night so that you can do it again and again and again.
Awesome. The other thing I'll mention that I'll just say I learned from Dr. Breus, like he's got great resources on his website, The Sleep Doctor, for best practices. Like, I underestimated the importance of a few simple hacks, like keeping the room cool, dark, and using earplugs. And like, this sounds like basic stuff, but I'm surprised at how many friends are like, oh, I can't sleep. And like, they're not really managing those factors. So that's some other sleep hygiene stuff I learned from you. Want to give credits due.
And thanks. And what I would tell people is, and it kind of goes along with this theme, equipment matters, right? So like, if you're a skier, right, and you have old crappy bindings and your boots don't fit and your shell isn't waterproof anymore, you can still make it down the mountain, but it's not going to be a lot of fun, right? But if you've got the right gear, you're safe, right? You're having a good time and you're performing well. I would argue that sleep is exactly the same way, right? Sleep is a performance activity. Therefore, when you show up, you want to make sure your environment is dark. You want to make sure your environment is cool. You want to make sure that your environment is quiet. Now, some of those things will be easy to factor and some of them won't. Maybe you're on vacation. So bring an eye mask. Bring some earplugs, right? Get a thing on your phone so you can have some meditating music if that's the thing that helps you fall asleep. But bring along all the accoutrement that you've got and utilize it, because that environment also plays a large role. Probably 25% of your ability to fall asleep and stay asleep is environmentally controlled.
Yeah. So I'm going to confess that I am guilty of the not always following the 7-day-a-week rule, because I was in Winter Park a couple months ago and saw a bunch of buddies from high school that I hadn't seen in 20 years.
Nice.
Didn't go to bed at the usual time that night.
Of course.
I had 2 drinks, So I will comment. Well, first, since I started using the sleep tracker, absolutely see the effects of alcohol and other sins on my sleep. But when we were developing ALTISNOOZE, and I should clarify why I say we as a team that I worked with, Dr. Breus is not doesn't have a stake in the business. He's doing this as a friend of the brand, but he did connect me with the team that helped develop it, and I told them, like, this needs to be battle tested for the sins that people do when they go to altitude, which I like an après-ski drink. I usually limit it to one. This other stuff, but what are there other things you specific to altitude that people might do to help them sleep besides, of course, ALTISNOOZE? I'm not trying to do a shameless plug here, but there's foundational stuff we covered. Like, if you can, go up there gradually. Don't go balls to the wall first day. Basic sleep hygiene, stay cool, dark, all that stuff. Are there any specific things to altitude you might mention or recommend, or just kind of graduate level tips for sleep that people might consider?
So there's a couple of things that I've actually done personally and that I've mentioned to people that are kind of interesting, that are a bit unique. So as an example, when you're acclimatizing, when you start out at the lowest of the high altitudes, while you're there, you should try to do some level of physical exertion. Right? I'm not saying run a mile, right? But maybe you take a walk for 15 minutes, do some good stretching, get your body used to movement at that altitude. Just sitting around watching TV at a new altitude is not what we're talking about here from an acclimatization standpoint. But you don't want to be super active, but you want to have some level of activity there, again, so your body can kind of get there. Another big thing that a lot of people don't think about is food. And so what are you eating? And making sure that you have enough energy stores, because remember, your body is going to be in a state of crisis when it gets up there. It doesn't know what's going on. There's not a lot of air. And so it says to itself, hey, this couldn't be good. So having good resource in your body is going to be important. So I always tell people, make sure you bring your supplementation. If you supplement, make sure you continue to do it. Make sure you continue to eat well in terms of whole food eating. You really want to avoid all of the ultra processed and packaged foods, the high sugar foods and things like that, because actually they affect melatonin, number one, so your body won't actually have the ability to fall asleep very easily, aside from just the oxygen exchange issue, but also going to bed on a full stomach, probably not the best idea. So I also tell people, you really want to think through that idea of what are you eating and when turns out to be a really big deal. So give yourself some space between when you stop everything and when you start. And so I came up with this fun thing called the 3-2-1 rule. So 3 hours before lights out, you stop alcohol. 2 hours before lights out, you stop food. 1 hour before lights out, you stop fluids, right? That's for terrestrially here in the mainland when you're here. When you're at altitude, I would say you probably, if you can avoid alcohol altogether, I would push that 3 closer to 6. So stopping alcohol roughly 6 hours before bed. So an après-ski at 3 o'clock in the afternoon is perfect, right? You just don't want to do that at 9:30, 10 o'clock at night.
I've become a day drinker when I
there you go. That's the best.
Late afternoon skier. Really bright après ski, not waiting. I don't want to wait. We're coming sort of up on time here in a little bit, so I'm just gonna prime people if they have any questions.
Throw it in here.
Start to post it in there. I'm gonna ask another question or two, so but feel free to type any questions you might have in there. Are there any myths related to altitude or sleep in general, or sleep at altitude that you hear and you're like, oh no, that's a big myth. That's all wrong. That people should know about.
Well, here's one thing. It's a general myth that I think is important for people to kind of think through, which is sleep is flexible and very few people need exactly 8 hours. So you need to be thoughtful in terms of continue to get the amount that you got before, but you don't necessarily need extra sleep because of this situation. In fact, I would argue that you should expect to be getting a little bit less quantity of sleep during this experience at altitude, no matter what. And so you should be building this in, which means, by the way, it could be a good idea to take a nap.
Yeah.
So for some people, halfway through the day, or if they finish early, taking a 30-minute nap is just the energizer bunny of their whole day. And it really helps them out because, again, remember, you're going to be at altitude, so your body's going to have a good bit of stress and pressure put on it.
Awesome. Thank you. We do have a question here from Mountain Soul. Any benefits of pre-treatment with ALTISNOOZE? Maybe I'll mention something you touched on. We were talking about the formula, cordyceps, which is a big adaptogen. To get that going in the system is beneficial because it takes a while for your body to respond to adaptogens.
Yeah, so I'm going to double tap on that as well. And so one of the main ingredients, the thing that's going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting inside of ALTISNOOZE are these mushrooms, these cordyceps mushrooms. So what's great about it is this is exactly the type of natural treatment that your body actually reacts much better to. And so I love the idea, but you do have to sometimes prime the pump, meaning you may want to take some of those ahead of time. In terms of ALTISNOOZE, you might want to be taking it a little bit earlier in the daytime in order for it to kind of kick in.
Awesome. This is so helpful. Any other questions from our folks out there?
I have one comment that I'd like to throw out there, if that's okay.
So 3 days ahead of skiing. I recommend people at least 1 day before, but 3 days ahead would be better. But yeah, I think 1 or 2 would be enough. But absolutely, what was your question or comment?
One of the things that you and I spoke about, I think last week when we were kind of talking about getting on Instagram and talking to people about sleep at altitude was this idea, well, what about if you're in an airplane?
Oh, yeah.
Right, at altitude.
Yeah.
Right? Like, would ALTISNOOZE be something that would make intuitive sense? So here's what I'll tell you is it's a different kind of altitude because it's a pressurized cabin, but I can't see how it would do any harm. I think it would make intuitive sense. Plus, remember, that air is a little bit different than the air that's down here, right? That's recirculated air that's running through the airplane. So it's not going to have as much oxygen content in it as we would want it to, similar to down here. So I would argue that, especially for people like if you got a long haul flight and you never sleep on an airplane, this could be an interesting experiment that you could try to run and see what would happen. To be clear, I don't think it would ever have a detrimental effect. I think it could only be positive.
I would love to make that part of the research that we will tee up at some point in the future. But I launched an Amazon page recently, and I've been surprised at how many people in the comments. We've got about 4.3 star reviews. Nice. How many people took it for a flight? And I didn't know until maybe 8 months into developing ALTISNOOZE that, like you said, planes are pressurized to about 6,000 to 8,000 feet. That's the regulatory requirement. It has to be, at least to that range. So that's like the altitude of Aspen that people are experiencing for as long as they're on the flight. And so I've been pleasantly surprised that people are finding another helpful occasion for it. But well, thank you so much. I want to give you an opportunity. Is there anything from your work as the sleep doctor? I know you have a new book out. Anything else you want to just make people aware of?
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to do so. I got a new book. It's called Sleep, Drink, Breathe. Wellness is Too Complicated. And it really talks about, it follows suit with what we're talking about because it is a natural, holistic approach to what's going on in your world. I extended a little bit past just sleep, and I talk about hydration, and I talk about breathing and breath work. But in the midst of our conversation, we've talked about breathing, we've talked about hydration, and we've talked about sleep. So I feel like the group here, if you guys are interested, check out the book. I think you would really enjoy it. It's very straightforward. It has a 3-week program to get people going. And I'd be excited to get some feedback from you.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Of
I'll
course.
also mention Dr. Breus has a cool tool on his website where you can find out your sleep type. There's 4 types.
Yes.
I'm a dolphin. Understanding your sleep sort of chronotype can give you personalized insights into improving your own sleep. So that's another great tool that I found of yours early on and
Thanks, bro.
enjoyed. So, hey, thank you so much for taking
Yeah.
time to share your insights. Super helpful. And thank you all for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and check it out. Like it's definitely a cool product. It's definitely one of those things that I think falls into that kind of natural, holistic category for helping people in a fun situation. So check it out.
Amazing. Thank you. Sweet dreams, everyone.
Peace.
Okay. Bye.